There is a specific kind of silence that follows the fall of a titan. In August of 1988, that silence fell over Maranello. Enzo Ferrari, the Drake, the man who built an empire on the high-pitched scream of 12 cylinders, was gone. The factory was a kingdom without its founder. The drafting boards were covered in dust, and the world was watching. They weren't just looking for a new car. They were looking for a sign of life. They were looking for proof that the soul of the Scuderia hadn't followed the old man into the history books. In 1989, that answer arrived. It was wedge-shaped, it was aggressive, and it was draped in the famous Rosso Corsa. It was the Ferrari 348. To some, it was a masterpiece. To others, it was a mistake. But to history, it was the bridge that refused to collapse. Look at it. Really look at it. The 348 didn't just look like a car. It looked like a statement. It was the last mid-engine V8 developed under the shadow of the old man's legacy, and it carried the DNA of his final years. It was often called the baby Testarossa, and for good reason. Those iconic side streaks, the horizontal slats that ran across the doors, were not just for cooling. They were the visual language of the late 80s. They were gills designed to swallow the road whole. At the back, the slatted taillights mirrored the front, creating a silhouette that felt like it was moving even when it was standing still in a showroom. It was the work of Pininfarina, overseen by Leonardo Fioravanti. It was a transition. It moved away from the tubular chassis of the past into a pressed steel monocoque. It was stiffer, lighter, and more modern. On paper, it was the future. On the road, it was something far more visceral. The name was a code 348, 3.4 liters, 8 cylinders. But the real magic was in the letters that followed: TB and TS, Trasversale Berlinetta and Trasversale Spider. Unlike the 328 that came before it, the 348 mounted its engine longitudinally, but its 5-speed gearbox was mounted transversely. This created a T-layout, lowering the center of gravity and pushing the weight into the middle of the car. It was a layout born from Formula One, a gift from the racetrack to the street. When you turned the key, you weren't just starting an engine, you were awakening 300 horses that lived at 7,200 RPM. There was no power steering. There were no driver aids. There was only you, the gated shifter, and the road. As the legendary journalist Gavin Green once wrote, "There is nothing like it. It communicates so richly. It involves you so completely." He was not talking about comfort. He was talking about a conversation between man and machine that often felt like a heated argument. But every legend has its scars. the 348 entered a world that was suddenly changing. In 1990, the Honda NSX arrived from the east. It was perfect. It was reliable. It was easy. Suddenly, the Ferrari felt difficult. The 348 had a reputation for being dirty. At high speeds, the rear end felt like it wanted to overtake the front. It was a car that demanded a master's touch, and if you were a novice, it would bite. Then came the corporate storm. Luca di Montezemolo, the man brought in to save the company, drove his own 348 and was horrified. He found himself outdragged by a common sedan at a stoplight. He famously said, "With the exception of its looks, I was utterly disappointed. This was the worst product Ferrari had launched for some time." He called it shameful. He saw a company that had lost its way, producing a car that was beautiful but flawed. The 348 became the middle child. It was stuck between the perfection of the 328 and the eventual brilliance of the F355. It was the car that lived in the shadow of giants. But distance gives us perspective. As the years turned into decades, the very things people hated about the 348 became the things we now crave. We live in an age of digital perfection. Modern supercars are so fast, they are almost boring. They shift for you, they stare for you, they save you from your own mistakes. But the 348 offers no such lies. It is a raw analog experience. It is the last Ferrari where you can feel the road through the rim of the steering wheel without the filter of a computer. Even Jeremy Clarkson, who gave the car a difficult time in his early years, eventually hit the nail on the head. He said, "A Ferrari is a pain when you're in a traffic jam. But the difference is, in a Ferrari, you can at least dream of the day when absolutely nothing else would do." Today, collectors look at the 348 and see a masterpiece of mechanical honesty. They see the Widowmaker and they smile, because they know that a car that scares you a little is a car that makes you feel alive. So how do we remember the Ferrari 348? We remember it as the car that held the line. It was the sacrifice. It was the machine that had to endure the transition from the old world to the new. It carried the weight of the Titans passing on its slatted shoulders. It took the criticism, it took the shame, and it stood its ground while the engineers in Maranello found their soul again. Without the 348, there is no F355, there is no 360 Modena, there is no 458 Italia. The 348 was the bridge. It was the moment Ferrari had to look in the mirror and decide what it wanted to be. It was the raw, unrefined energy of a legacy trying to find its voice in a silent room. It was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be Ferrari. And as the sun sets over the hills of Emilia-Romagna, and the sound of that V8 echoes through the valley, we realize that the 348 didn't just carry Ferrari through a moment of crisis. It carried Ferrari through the moment it had to find itself again.